In this week's question of the week, Ian and I ask, is architecture really your problem, or is it actually your financial model? Related to that, we have Conway's Law and Miell's Law. And then what you see is with Ian's follow the money methodology, we have a beginner's guide to finance for engineers and engineering managers. Enjoy. We're asking this question, is architecture your problem, or is it your financial model? This is the genesis or the thesis of your latest book, isn't it? Follow the Money.
That's right, yeah. So I noticed in my years working in software that people tend to view software engineering and architecture as something that's separate, is a separate concern from the rest of the business. And over time, especially working in consulting, I see the same patterns over and over again, and I see that they relate to how teams are funded. And I thought what I'm saying is kind of obvious to a lot of people, but it's not really ever discussed directly in the literature. And that goes back all the way to Conway's Law. So I'm sure you'll discuss this with Sam, but Conway's Law states that the architecture of your system roughly states, it's not a verbatim quote, roughly that the architecture of your system will reflect the communication structures of your organization. And that's fine, that's all well and good. But what determines, if you ask the 5 whys question, you always, if something's a problem, you always ask 5 whys. If you ask the 5 whys question about that, you've got to ask yourself, where do those communication structures come from? And the straightforward answer is those communication structures come from the structure of your organization. If you're on the same team, you'll be talking to people on the same team, daily stand-ups, whatever, or you're more likely to. And if you are separated from another team, you're less likely to be communicating with those. Fine. So the organization, but what creates the organization structure? And that's a harder question to answer. And I think it's related very much to, it's related to several things, but fundamentally it comes from, where does the money come from? And then you ask, why does the money come from here? And then you get into all the various things. What this means is that if your paying customers are a small number of very large businesses, your organization structure is probably going to reflect that. So if you've got 3 customers, all of which pay a third of your income, you're probably going to have 3 separate teams dealing with those customers separately.
Because those customers are so important.
Yeah, if you lose one of those customers, it's going to be a big deal. So you want people to service those customers directly. But if you have 1 million customers or 1 billion customers like Google, you're not going to have a team for each customer. You're not going to have a team for each country even. You're just going to have a product team that deals with the product.
A product team. So you mentioned Conway's Law, that a system reflects the communication structure of the organisation that built it or is looking after it. Where does Miell's Law fit in? Because Miell's Law is an extension of Conway's Law, isn't it? So what is Miell's Law?
Yeah, so I've
and who gave it that name?
I've somewhat arrogantly given it that name, and it's a bit of a joke. But essentially, Miell's Law is the organizational structure of your business will reflect ultimately the architecture of your business will reflect, architecture of your software will reflect ultimately the sources of funding for your organization. So it kind of extends Conway's Law. And actually, I'm just writing the chapter on sort of discussing this. So in the middle of the book, I kind of go back and talk about Conway's Law and Miell's Law. And it's interesting, Conway worked for academia and large research and development business units of even bigger businesses like IBM and Xerox. And so for Conway, he never really dealt with a customer as such. He worked on committees which were funded by universities. And I don't think he was so interested, for perfectly natural reasons, wasn't so interested in how those structures came into being. It was kind of a given for him. I don't know the details of his life. I'm just kind of assuming. because his paper, which is very short and naturally he doesn't go into great depths about a lot of things, just talks about the committee being set up, just kind of takes it as a given. And having worked in many different organizations in my career, I've seen that the way things are funded can vary quite a lot. And the way
does this mean then, Ian, so the reverse Conway maneuver is about changing your organisation if you want to change your architecture? Does Miell's law imply a second step, that if you want to change your organisation and therefore your architecture, you need to alter the way money flows? Is there a metaphor? Is it like a river? The tributaries of funding flow into a big stream? Are we redirecting the river? Are we damming certain tributaries and opening others up?
Yeah, I mean, I see this kind of pattern a lot where, for example, I worked for a major UK bank, well, in fact, a major global bank, and which I won't name, and they used to go on about being agile, and you be agile, remove your blockers, let's be agile, blah 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 blah, and it was crazy because to be agile, you'd have to spin up a team like that. Suddenly we've decided this is really important. If you're going to be agile as an organization, not as a small team, as an organization, you've got to be able to say, right, it's really important we get this done. So let's spin up a team and get it going and so on. And, how do you do that? Well, you have to fund that team. So you have to move money from one place to another. At this bank, they would fund one of the 4 or 5 or 6 business units yearly. And then that yearly funding would determine how much each team got in that. So the idea of spinning up a new team to do something would never happen. And so every year you'd have this discussion about what needs to change. And yet they were saying, let's be agile and decide what to do on a weekly basis. It could never work.
It's almost like saying we need to be agile, but then almost downplaying or totally ignoring the systematic changes that would be required to make that happen. It's a bit like the captain of a tanker saying, we want to be an agile tanker from now. Well, that's a great intent, but you've got this huge ship. How do you propose, what changes do you need to make to that ship to make it more agile?
Yeah, and so the other pattern that made me think of this, or another pattern, was working for B2B companies. So I mentioned just if you've got 3 customers and they're each providing a third of your income, you're probably going to have 3 teams servicing them. There's a very common pattern in transformation, which is B2B company grows its customers. So it goes from 3 to maybe 6 or 7, and it decides we're going to be a product company now, and we're going to build products. And I would say that, okay, if you're serious about doing that, you need to restructure the funding away from team-based funding and towards product. And that's really, really hard to do because suddenly you're saying no to your customers.
But it's not just funding though, is it, Ian? Because there's also the incentive structure. So in that pattern you've talked about where a software provider decides they want to go SaaS and build a product, you have a bunch of people who are incentivized and have got decades of experience selling licenses, and all of a sudden, the same people, I was going to say the same men, it usually is men, the same people have to now sell a customer journey and make sure that the customer is using that software as they would use Slack or HubSpot. And so the mindset is utterly different. So it's not just where the money is flowing, but how those incentives are created, which is, of course, I guess, is that the flip side of the same coin?
Yeah, it is. I mean, incentives can come in many forms. So it's not just financial. But broadly, if you don't get paid, you probably won't go to work, right? You don't work for your company for the love of it. Typically, I can't think anyone would. But ultimately, it's money based. So those incentives, if they're not aligned with your company strategy, then you're going to be in trouble. And that goes for the business as well. The business is incentive. Customers will say to you, do this for us and we'll give you a bunch of money. Ignore your product, give us this feature in the next 6 months. It's really important to us. I know it's going to cause you problems with your product roadmap, but we really want it. Here's a bunch of money. That's an incentive for your business.
When you talk about Conway's law and Miell's law, and in this case you're talking about customers, I'm guessing then Conway's law extends beyond the boundary of the organisation. It's not just the company, but it's also the communication channels into it from their customer base.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing, okay, so that's a bigger question, I think. So the way of thinking I'm proposing is very much systems thinking thing, and in systems thinking, you kind of ignore the great details of the problem, try and focus on what's important. A bit like order notation in computer science, if anyone's done that, when you
nobody who listens to this is old enough to remember.
Well, okay,
order notation.
But you try and ignore the details and focus on what's
it's
really
the broad
significant.
brushstrokes, isn't it?
Broad brushstrokes. So I'm proposing that you ignore those communication structures between the customer and between the what I call the patron, but let's call it the customer now. The customer and the business, and you treat that as a simple flow of money. If you think of it as a diagram, just money flows in and work comes out. But yes, there are communication structures with businesses, with your customers as well, and those can be complicated. But ultimately, who do you pick up the phone to? If you're in a business, who do you pick up the phone to? You pick up the phone to the person writing the checks. And you pick up the phone to the others, but probably only insofar as they influence the check writer, ultimately.
Is this about being ruthless or analytical, Ian? Is there something in this story about being more analytical? Because I do remember when we helped a customer, it's going back 5-6 years now. And again, it's that classic case study. They wanted to become a SaaS company. Now, investors realise that, if you're SaaS, you get a greater multiplier, and that's because you need less people to run the software. And exactly like HubSpot, you could have millions of customers. And when we visited them, they had 2 big customers and the third one that needed to be onboarded, and that was going to be worth millions and millions and millions. But they only had limited headcounts or budgets for headcounts. And even if they wanted to expand their team, which they probably had the money for, but it's not easy to hire talented DevOps engineers and all of that. And it turned out that when we took a look at each of their customers, and this was really a strange exercise because I said, let's do a bit of financial analysis. And people don't usually call container solutions, and they definitely don't call me. They want to pop open a spreadsheet and look at some profit and loss. That's Kate's department. But anyway, I said, can we just look at these numbers briefly? So we prepared that with the finance team, and then we eventually got around the table. And of the 5 key customers, 1 customer consumed or required 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 DevOps engineers to look after them. Now, those engineers could have worked in a different area, could have worked on the product, could have helped move this product to becoming a truly SaaS. But the revenue from that customer was measured in the tens of thousands versus the potential millions of the new customer. So I asked, why? Why don't you let this customer go? And the chief executive said, we can't. It was our founding customer. We can't do that to them. And on the one hand, I respect that. They'd helped you get to where you are, and you don't want to leave anybody in the lurch. But literally releasing or letting go of 100,000 or a couple of £100,000 worth of revenue over there, and pissing off a customer, by the way, would potentially create the space to generate millions over there and take a solid step towards becoming a SaaS company. And I wonder there, for my question, I'm sorry, it's a long-winded question. My question is this about becoming more analytical, less humane about these decisions and more rational?
Yes, I think it is, because to take that example, so that's a pretty good example that you've given there of the kind of sentimental CEO. I see. Was it the CEO you were talking to?
It was the CEO, yeah.
Yeah. So he feels personally bonded to that customer, and this human factor is a real thing. And it's slightly confounding to the systems thinking thing. What I would argue is that in the long run, that argument's not going to win, because if that CEO has a board and that board hears the arguments, they're not going to say, oh yes, we've got to keep that customer happy. If private equity comes in and buys them out, they're not going to say, oh no, we must keep that original customer happy, even though they're only tens of thousands and the plan is to make millions off these other of more customers. They're going to say, sorry, let's send them a Fortnum's hamper and say thank you very much, and move on with the business.
Yeah, fuck you very much and goodbye. Ian, ask me what the Andy Grove principle is, or the Andy Grove question?
What is the Andy Grove question, Jamie?
That's a great question, mate. When they had their memory crisis, Andy Grove had he was zombieing around, panicked. What are we going to do? Japanese memory is going to kill us. We've got this microprocessor capability, but it's rubbish. He shuffled into Gordon Moore's office and he said to Moore, Gordon, if the investment, if the board of directors brought in a new management team, what would they do? And Gordon Moore instantly answered, they'd get us out of memory. That was the question back there for that chief executive. If a new CEO was brought in, what would be the first thing they'd do? They'd drop that old customer. So that ability, so I call it the revolving door principle. Go out the revolving door, ask yourself if you've got the stomach to come back in it and do what needs to be done. If not, you should stay on the other side. And as I personally think, the numbers can confront people with that reality. If you look at them starkly and coldly, you're like, well, what else can we do now except, what other decision could we take?
Yeah. I mean, this gets to the heart of a question that comes up a lot when I'm talking about this book. So the book, someone said to me, does this make you very fatalistic about the business that you're in? Because, if your funding model is antithetical to the software architecture you want to build, ultimately, or the organization structure you want to build, then you may as well give up. And I have a chapter in the book about things that confound this sort of fatalistic point of view. So you can have inspirational leaders and owners like your CEO who don't want to go with the flow of where the money's taking them, and those factors can take effect. But it's very hard. You have to have something that sustains it and a vision of where you're going.
I once helped a company, Ian, and all of their profits were going into an open source project that they hoped would one day in the future bring them something. It was such a bad... I mean, I'm pretty romantic. And a lot of my decisions when I was the chief exec of Container Solutions were based in what could be rather than what was. But this team were even... they were way, if there was a spectrum and I was at one end of it, they were way beyond where I was. And I think Peter Drucker used to say stuff like, no good manager would sacrifice today's profits for a fantasy future, or a future that doesn't exist. That's literally the definition of bad management. Well, this is what that team were doing. They were placing a fantastical future on the one hand and burning all today's profits on another. If that continues, there is no business. And so on the rare occasion when we looked at numbers, they do tell a story. And I suppose my question is, what was your inspiration? Are you trying to give managers and engineers the levers they need to instigate change?
I view it more as therapy for frustrated engineers. So if you're a frustrated engineer and you're thinking, why are we not doing the right thing? This can help you understand why things are the way they are, and perhaps either become more at peace with it or understand what it takes to change it. Because a lot of engineers think, oh, this is just a technical argument. If I win the technical argument, then I'll be done. But there's often...
Foolish engineers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in a way. I'm always a big advocate for people changing the environment they work in so that they learn something new. So if you're an engineer and you go work in sales, you learn a lot. In fact, I was watching a thing about The Office the other day, the British then American TV show, and apparently a lot of the writers were actors. And
right.
I've always wondered why that was. So Toby Flenderson and BJ Novak, who plays the kid Ryan, who plays Ryan, and Mindy Kaling, they were all actors and writers, and I thought they were just tremendously talented. But apparently, the runner always tried to make the writers act in the show so they could understand what it was like to read the lines.
Right,
for
bit
real.
of empathy.
Bit of empathy,
Yeah.
and apparently it cohered the team much, much better.
Oh, remarkable. Well, it's funny you should mention writing and storytelling, because if I think of your book, Follow the Money, one of the most important things in leadership is you need to have a story. And so you need to have a team. So as I said, when I was running Container Solutions, you have to have a team who are happy to make believe with you. But nowadays we have such complex organisations. You've got dev, operations people, finance people. The first team or the first group you tell your story to is your own team, because they need to believe in it in order for us to then take our customers to this wonderful new future. Follow the money is another tool. So we've got design patterns, we've got technology, and now you've created a bit of a lingua franca. I mean, what was DevOps about? It was about having the same tools and the same language in dev and ops. All of a sudden, you've provided a bit of an idiot's guide or maybe a beginner's guide to finance and money flows within an organization.
Well, this argument was always there within the DevOps discussion, because the whole point, DevOps is a much discussed term, but for me, the point of DevOps was not to have separate teams for development and operations, and to have them within one team, which through which communication could flow much easier. And formally, you'd have two separate funding flows, one to operations and one to development. And in order to make them come together the way that we wanted it to, you had to have a single flow of funds. But everyone ignored that and just said, "Oh, we'll be DevOps now. Devs should talk to ops more. We're done. Yeah. That's DevOps." And actually, it doesn't. It's much harder to make that work if you haven't got the funding structures in place.
The joke is that you didn't need to speak more with each other. What you needed was a tool set that was understandable in both camps. Thanks for watching Container Solutions TV. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on YouTube and follow Container Solutions on LinkedIn for cut down parts and weekly clips. If you want help with platform engineering, cloud native transformation, or you need to follow the money in order to change how you operate your cloud at scale, then visit our website using the links below and get in touch. We'll see you in the next episode.